Welcome and thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm Nicole Seligman, a member of the board of the church and a great Frank Bruni fan, and I'm delighted to welcome you here. Frank Bruni needs little introduction. He's a prominent journalist for most of his career at the New York Times, with a wide range of roles, the breadth of which speaks to his talent. Rome bureau chief, chief restaurant critic, White House correspondent, and of course, op-ed columnist. He's also the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, including his most recent, The Age of Grievance. Now, the interesting thing about Frank today is he's now living in 2 different worlds. For the New York Times, writing his very popular weekly newsletter, if you don't subscribe, I recommend it, and periodic columns, and also now a full professor at Duke University in the Public Policy Department. I think of that, frankly, as the frying pan into the fire, and it's sure an interesting time both to be in the journalist environment and the university environment, and I think we'll all hear a little bit more about that tonight. And there's more. Here's something you probably don't know about Frank Bruni. He's also become an honorary citizen of Sag Harbor, where Frank and his beloved dog Regan, and for those of you who do read his newsletter, you know about Regan, spent much of COVID with me and my husband, Joel Klein, and he's come to love Sag Harbor as much as we do. Now, Frank brings a special gift to his work. He has a great mind that resists the lemming instinct. He is at heart a fact gatherer whose insights, as a result, are based on facts and not ideology. And then, on top of that, he's a fantastic, gorgeous writer whose craftsmanship spoils all of us. Now, Frank's new book challenged and changed the way I look at politics and the way I look at the world. It gave me a new filter of understanding for reading what I'm reading about and thinking what I'm thinking about. And I know you will enjoy hearing about it. We have books in the back, and after the Q&A, Frank looks forward to signing any of the books that you might like him to sign, inscribing them to anybody you might like them inscribed to, and getting a chance to say hello. Now, Frank will be interviewed tonight by my husband, Joel Klein, former head of the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department under Bill Clinton, and former head and chancellor of the New York City schools under Mike Bloomberg for many years, and as said, a great fan and resident of Sag Harbor. Over to you, gentlemen.
So good advice to all of you. Have your spouse introduce you. So I really welcome you all. I'm so thrilled that you're here because this is a night I love. I love this church, which April and Eric were so kind to anchor and give to our community. I love Frank Bruni, and I love this book. Very few books help you think about the world, especially this world, which is so crazy, in a more coherent, more understandable, more digestible way. Frank has that unique talent to do that. If you haven't read the book, please do. Let's get on with the interview, Frank. What do you mean by grievance?
So you're starting with a softball. First of all, thank you all for coming. It's nice to see you. Thank you for doing this, Nicole. Thank you for one of the nicest introductions I've ever had. I appreciate that. I love you too, and I love that you've introduced me to and welcomed me to Sag Harbor. So grievance, it's interesting. I mean, if you go back in time and you look at uses of the word grievance 100 years ago, 200 years ago, if you look at the First Amendment of the Constitution, a grievance used to have a positive connotation. The redressing of your grievances was a right, it was a good thing. If you went home tonight and just for the next week started kind of taking note of every time you see the word grievance used in a news report, and you see it all the time, it means something totally different, and that change is an indication of something that's gone wrong. We are now mingling absolutely urgent complaints with utterly petty stuff. Or we're taking things that are worth noting and worth complaining a little bit about, and we're metastasizing them and going crazy with them. So the invented keeps company with the absolute legitimate and urgent. And so when I talk about the age of grievance, I'm talking about an age in which complaint has become such a reflex and so indiscriminate that we can no longer see the forest for the trees. We're in defensive postures all the time. We're intent on figuring out how we've been wronged, who's wronged us, the magnitude of that injustice and who we should get back at. And it has kind of trapped us in this culture and climate of anger and recrimination that I think are destroying our civic life and impeding any progress.
What got you into it? I mean, how did you come upon grievance and
Well, I mean, a couple of things. One was that I was seeing the word so often and in such negative connotations. I thought that says something, and it just kind of got me to thinking about things. But there were two other things. One was, Nicole mentioned the pandemic, and I did spend more time here than I ever had before then. I was shocked, if you remember, when we kind of first realized something enormous was going on, something that was a national emergency, something that had the potential to affect everybody across class, across race, whatever. I remember thinking this is going to be a little bit like the 9/11 moment. We're going to have some national cohesion, we're going to come together, we're going to be a little bit less nasty to one another. And it was the exact opposite. There was not even a grace period. It was our divisions, our polarization turbocharged. And the fact that we couldn't get past that the way we had after 9/11, I think spoke to how much, it just said to me that a lot had changed over those decades, and not for the better, and that we kind of needed to examine and talk about that. And the other thing that happened was personal and is much smaller, but I hope this will make sense. But the previous book I wrote to this, much of which I wrote in your guest house, which was called The Beauty of Dusk, and was about a very rare stroke I had, and the medical odyssey I went through, and living with the threat of going blind and losing sight in one eye and all of that. When I was talking, I wrote the book because I thought that my journey might have resonance for people and might even be instructive and be helpful. And I talked about how I realized what a trapped self-pity was and how I tried to avoid it, and on and on. And I didn't interview, I was lucky to do many interviews about that book, and I did one with Terry Gross for NPR, and I guess I said, because it came back to me, I guess I said to her, I realized that if I fell into depression and stayed there, the longer I stayed there, the harder it would be to get out. Now, I was using depression with a small d, a lowercase d, and I said stuff like that in the book. I got some mail, I got some feedback. Most of the feedback in the book was very positive, but I got, this even happened at a few events, people angry at me, telling me how cool I was. Because in talking about my own resilience and how I had kind of avoided this stuff and whatever, I was mocking and making feel bad anyone who'd not had that experience. And it really rattled me, because one, I thought for a second, well, there's some truth to that, I get that. Like, I can see, and maybe in the future, maybe in the book, I should have been even more careful with my terms, but I wasn't that careless. And I realized this was, in that particular area, something that I was seeing in the public space as well, which is just this itch to be offended, this desire to be angry, and this determination to kind of see offense and injustice if you could possibly see it. If there was any way to divine it, you were going to divine it, and you were going to go on the attack. And that was another kind of thing that got me thinking about these themes and wanted to write about it.
And why now? I mean, you made the point, in 9/11, right, we came together, there was a kind of national moment. Now, it's all polarized. Why?
I think it's been a process, and the things I'll mention existed at 9/11, during 9/11, but I think it intensified and amplified. There are a number of things going on that I think combine to create this culture of grievance. One is, and I don't think we talk about this or realize it as much as we could and should. One is, we've taken, in my lifetime, I'm 59, we've taken an extraordinary and profound turn in this country, from a fundamental optimism to a fundamental pessimism. And the numbers bear this out. Fewer Americans believe their children will have better lives than they did. Fewer Americans believe the future will be better than the past. fewer Americans think that the economy will reliably grow and that prosperity will expand, right? And you see this in survey after survey. One of the most striking things is Gallup, for decades, I think since the 1970s, I have this specific information in the book, has asked Americans several times a year, so that they have these markers through time, several times a year, are you satisfied with the direction of the country? And up until 2004, many years, like you would have periods where over 50% said yes and then under 50%. Many years, every time they did the survey, it was over 50%. From 2004 till now, 20 straight years, we have not gotten to 50% or over in the answer to that question. And usually, it is fewer than 40% or fewer even than 30% of Americans who say they're generally satisfied. It wasn't like that before 2004. If you're living at a time and in a country where you don't trust that things will grow, you don't trust that things will get better, your relationship with your neighbor, with your fellow citizen, is less collaborative and more competitive. You believe that if somebody else is getting ahead, you must be falling behind. And that, I think, is a powerful engine of grievance. There are other factors, but that's one that I think is much kind of more central to this than people realize.
In the book you say, and it's got to be right, there are some grievances that are obviously legitimate, and some trivial and inconsequential. Give us one that's legit, and give us one that's trivial.
Well, I mean, I want to answer that by talking about a legitimate one that people sometimes summon and talk about it in such illegitimate circumstances that they end up kind of debasing the grievance and they end up actually undermining the cause. And in that sense, I would talk about racism, right? We live in a world, we live in a country where racism is still a very, very serious problem. There are examples of it all over the place, and there are people who do not get a fair shake and do not have those people who don't want to wrestle with this an invitation to tune out. And a really great example of this, which many of you, I think, as I start talking about it, will remember and recognize, when Brittany Griner was horrifically imprisoned in Russia, and it was unclear what would happen to her, as it's unclear right now what's going to happen to Evan Gershkovich, right? Sorry? Oh. I thought someone was going to tell me I mispronounced his last name, because I almost surely did, and this is why I don't do TV. I spell really well and pronounce almost nothing. So if there's like kind of subtitles, those will be better, right? But I started to see, and saw it frequently in commentary on the left, from people whose kind of brand is crying racial injustice or crying homophobia or whatever. I started to see like columns and commentary about how Brittany Griner was languishing and was not getting attention because she was black, because she was a woman, and because she's gay. I was hearing more about Brittany Griner than I heard about any political prisoner over the past 2 decades, easily, maybe longer. I only learned about Paul Whelan, who is still a political prisoner in Russia and predated her imprisonment. Most of us only learned about him because he was mentioned like in the 6th or 7th paragraph of a 25-paragraph story about her. I don't begrudge the attention she got at all, but it was the exact opposite. She wasn't getting that attention because she was black, because she was gay, because she was a woman. She was getting that attention because she was a celebrity. But to decide, like, oh, I'm someone who sees racial injustice and I'm going to graft that complaint onto this story, that sort of thing happens all the time, where people have this lens through which they're determined to see the world. They have this kind of, their shingle is the articulation of a certain kind of grievance. And so they use it, they employ it everywhere, to the point where they become non-credible. They don't become credible anymore. They hurt their own cause, and they give the people whom they're supposedly trying to change, kind of, and illuminate, they give them a reason to remain in the dark because what those people are hearing is so easy to tune out.
In the book you say, well, there's grievance issues on both the left and the right. You sort of come out and say it's worse on the right than the left. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, it's a subjective judgment, of course, because there's no kind of metric for this. I mean, what I say and what I believe is that the sort of impulse I'm describing, the sort of reflex, that habit of mind, the reflex, not reflux, like sounds like I had a bad meal today, it's like some Freudian. That dynamic, that habit of mind exists across the political spectrum, across the ideological spectrum. But I believe, and what I say that right now, I believe it's more worrying and some of the consequences are more disturbing on the right. And what I mean by that is I do not see the same pervasiveness and magnitude of election denialism on the left that I see on the right. I don't think we've seen as much political violence on the left as we have on the right. It's forces on the right who are plotting to kidnap and God knows do what else to Gretchen Whitmer. It was January 6th was an event that was driven by the right. Paramilitary groups exist on the right but not on the left. I think it's important in an age when people kind of are quick to cry both sidesism or false equivalence. It's important to say there can be a problem that has many, many different manifestations and that spans the spectrum, but I'm not saying it's the same on both sides or it's exactly, arithmetically proportionate all over the place.
So it's not a case where the wish is father to the thought.
No, I don't know. But this is one of the things I read a lot in the book, and I really believe this is humility, like, I could be wrong, I'm willing to talk to people who think that's wrong, and one of the failures, there are probably many failures of the book, but some people have taken exception to the fact that in my discussion of political violence, I left out some of the extraordinary, arson, vandalism, etc., associated with the Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd's murder. And it's a failing. I should have mentioned it in the book. It's very difficult to write something today that doesn't kind of bang the drums for one party or one side and figure out exactly what to mention, what not to mention. You're worried, like, again, you don't want to kind of get accused of both sidesism, but you also don't want to be a partisan. And in the kind of delicate calibrations I was making, it was absolutely a mistake to leave that out.
Now, one thing about on the left seems to me this whole issue of identity, which you've already raised and so forth. How does grievance and identity, what's the connection there?
Well, I'm gonna push back at one thing you just said. You said on the left identity. I cannot think of an identity politician. I cannot think of a better example of an identity politician than the nation is run by childless cat ladies, J.D. Vance. The MAGA movement is an identity politics movement. What's the relationship? People whose politics are driven by identity, people who define themselves in terms of whatever that category is, that almost always goes hand in hand with this relentless, obsessive measurement of the slights against that category, what is owed to that category. Grievance culture is all about how I am being wronged in relation to everybody else. It's not about the collective, it's not about civic health, it's not about the collective good, it's not about the community. And identity groups are not about the larger community, they're about taking the larger community and slicing it up as narrowly and I think corrosively as you can.
So indulge me a second, I want to read you something from one of my favorite authors. It's a piece in the Times that says, I'm a white man, hear me out. I'm a white man, so you should listen to absolutely nothing I say. At least nothing on matters of social justice. I have no standing, no way to relate. My color and gender nullify me, and it gets worse. I grew up in the suburbs, dad made 6 figures, so on and so forth. But wait, I'm gay, and I mean gay from a different, darker day. So on and so forth about keep being gay. So where does that leave me? Who does that make me? All right, so Frank Bruni wrote that piece.
Yeah, it sounded a bit familiar with me.
Where does it leave you? What does it make you? What was the reception at the time when you wrote it, and would you write it today?
I would write it today, and I think I've kind of written echoes of it today, and I think of all the pieces I've written in the last 5 or what, I can't remember exactly when that was, it's probably the one that is most similar in spirit to the book, which I just wrote. Where it leaves me is where it should leave any one of us, the validity of our perspective, the relevance of our voices, of each person's voice, the validity of each person's perspective, does not arise from how much money they do or don't have, by how dark or light their skin color is, and on and on. And we've slid, not all of us, but too many of us have slid into this era where, and honestly, I think the reaction to October 7th, some of the reactions, I think some of what you saw in campus protests illustrated this, where we're too often equating the legitimacy of someone's voice. We're judging that in terms of, have they been oppressed? Are they powerless? Are they powerful? Like what you see with a lot of young people's romanticization of Hamas, right? Determination to say from the river to the sea, even after they've been told what that means. They're assessing that conflict in terms of who has the money, who doesn't have the money, who has the power, who doesn't, and they're making moral judgments in accordance with that rather than with actions. And also, when you start doing that, where do you draw the parameters of history, right? When I hear some students talking about Israel as if it's this blessed from the beginning wonderland of unearned privilege, it's like, how many of you know the history of how Israel came into existence? Like when you're playing villain and victim, how far back in time do you go? Well, the answer is, it's a stupid taxonomy. It's a stupid moral taxonomy. It's a stupid way to look at the world because, it's because you're invariably kind of randomly choosing a moment in time.
So for this discussion, you're in two of the most interesting institutions right now, right? The New York Times and a major university. So at the Times, we had sort of lived through the Bennett termination, the end of his leadership, the withering attack he made on the Times in the economy.
I read all 13,000 words of it.
It could have used it.
He's a friend. I love James. I keep in touch with James.
So let's look. Should people be concerned with where the media is today and the politicization of the media? And then I want to come to the university.
Well, I want to leave the Times out of it, not only as a matter of discretion and perhaps cowardice. No, but I actually think, and I am not objective about this, but I actually think the problems when it comes to the media, and the Times draws a lot of fire because of its footprint in the world. But I actually think the problems in the media, I don't think the Times is the main problem. I think the Times is better on a lot of scores than other organizations, and I think the problems are larger and more structural than that. We now have a media ecosystem, universe, whatever you want to call it, in which there's so many more players, and in which those players kind of find their niche by just kind of throwing in with a given perspective or a kind of micro-political orientation, and then consumers go to those providers who are telling them exactly what they want to hear based on what they already believe, and thus their inclinations become florid prejudices, right? We have there was a saying years ago on people kind of talking about news tools they were designing that in the Times, I even saw this phrase used in some documents about the Daily Me, and it was like whether you're one news organization who's now blasting stories to people based on what they've read before, or whether you're a new organization figuring out exactly who your audience is and how you're going to cater to them. It wasn't about telling people things they don't know. It wasn't about bringing them outside of themselves and challenging them to see different colors in the universe, and to have and to be exposed to perspectives they hadn't already been exposed to. It was about the exact opposite. The crisis right now, when it comes to media and information, isn't whether we should or should not have run the Tom Cotton piece at the New York Times. It's about how do you pull people away from constructing news environments and information universes that are so narrow, that are so predetermined by what they want to believe about the world. I mean, how many, if you're not a regular consumer of Fox News and you start watching Fox News, you finally understand why a lot of people are voting in certain ways or saying certain things, because that's all they're hearing. when I go way too infrequently to the Planet Fitness in Chapel Hill near my home, I always like to stand on the same treadmill if it's open, because it's the one that, like, right here and right here are MSNBC and Fox News. And I cushion the blows of it, and I make the experience more palatable by just watching, right? I have, like, Chapel Roan playing in my ears or something like that. But it's just fascinating because I'm going back a little bit in time, but on Fox News, the border is like 45 minutes of every hour. And there are, like, there are backdrop walls where they found the name of everyone ever killed by someone who came across the border illegally, and it's like a kind of a board, right? On MSNBC, we don't have a southwestern border. But I mean, on Fox News, this is going, Hunter Biden and his laptop are every 10 minutes. On MSNBC, Joe Biden doesn't have a son. You know what I mean? And you realize that is just one illustration of what is turning this country apart.
One of the things that seems to me is there's a lot more editorial on the front page, a lot more opinion in the news section, and a lot less reporting. Is that fair?
I don't know how, that may, I don't know if that's fair. Here's what I would say to that. There's more opinion. First of all, what's the front page? That's certainly like, you're sounding a little bit like you've zoomed in from the Mesozoic era, right? Shit, I think Joel was going to pay for dinner, but that's for most people, the front page is the home page, right? And you can't like judge that against what the front page of the newspaper looked like 20 years ago because they're different entities. Opinion actually, in my time at the Times, opinion actually has been downgraded. We used to have the top right-hand corner of the home page. Now there's other stuff and we're a little further down. You see more opinion in news organizations than you did before because it's what readers want. And for a news organization to stay in business, like I will use the example of the Times because I think there's a kind of virtuous dynamic there. There are critics of the Times who kind of joke and say, the Times, a games company that occasionally prints stories. But whether it's Wordle or Connections or Strands, which is a new one I'm addicted to, right? Whether it's the recipe database, that revenue is what helps fund things like a Baghdad bureau, which if you're going by clicks, or something that I may be using an example that's already outdated, but that funds foreign bureaus that by clicks alone are not supporting themselves or whatever. So every news organization has to be responsive to what customers want, or it doesn't have money to do all the virtuous things it wants to do that, in a more perfect world, would be self-funding but aren't. People, it's a shocker, but if you look at the trending list of the 13 stories at any given moment that are getting the most eyeballs, you will notice not a lot of foreign news on those 13. You'll notice a lot of Beyonce and Taylor Swift stories. And you'll notice a lot of opinion journalism. It turns out we can now, we meaning the news, every news organization, we can know what the audience is doing like never before. Right? When I began at the Times, if you wanted to know, which is pretty much the Mesozoic era, if you wanted to know what readers were doing, you had to do a reader survey, you had to do a focus group. These are really clumsy, blunt instruments, and you were relying on people's, the honesty of their self-reporting, and most people would tell you, oh yeah, I go first to the foreign section. And when there's time, maybe I look at the arts section and that celebrity profile, maybe, but not. We now know exactly what people are doing. There's a kind of tool at the Times that I can go to as someone who still has some staff access and all that, and I can look at all the things I've written since this tool came into existence, how many clicks each one got, what the average amount of time people spent with it was. Like, so were they reading to the bottom or not? Did they come to it from a mobile device? Did they come to it from a Google search? Did they come to it from the home page? And on and on. What news organizations have learned as they've been able to know in an honest way what people are doing is that they love to read opinion journalism. And so you see more opinion journalism. And I do think that's a little bit of a problem in the sense that opinion journalism tends to, by its nature, have an edge, a perspective. It's not something most often kind of calling us to step outside of ourselves and unite. It is often, even if this isn't its point, it's often a tool in partisan warfare. And so I do think that's a problem.
Go to your other institution, the university. Is that a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, there is, if you look at the statistics, I don't have them in front of me, of when they have kind of done serious examinations of faculty at universities. Faculty, I should say, outside of the STEM fields, because there's a big difference between STEM and humanities. But the political orientation of faculty who teach in the humanities, it's further left than the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And that, there's no way that's not going to affect instruction, you know? And it leads to certain kind of voguish concepts, certain presumptions that are a problem. Like it leads to a kind of groupthink and a kind of rush to judgment. That's the opposite of kind of intellectual honesty. The first course I taught at Duke, we happened to be having a discussion one day, and we were talking about issues and the way they changed over time and not. We were talking about the Republican Party. And I said to my students, I said, it's interesting because when you look at gay rights, same-sex marriage, those numbers actually moved a lot over recent decades in the Republican Party. You know, to the point where even among Republicans, I think, I don't have the survey data in front of me, recent years have complicated this, but basically so. And I said at that point in time, the abortion numbers hadn't moved. And I said, anyone have any kind of, it'd be interesting to talk about why. Anyone have any kind of theories or feelings about why? The first person who put her hand up, I called on her, and she said, yes, white supremacy. And I said, okay, how does white supremacy explain this? And she said, white women have abortions at much higher rates than women of color. And so Republicans are attached to the outlawing and the minimization of abortion because they want to keep a majority white country. And I said, okay, do you have, I gotta tell you, you have it exactly opposite. And there's in fact an interesting kind of body of like journalism about should we actually be thinking of permissive abortion as a kind of eugenics, like people who push that to whatever. She looked at me like I told her that I just stood behind the Yeti in the Duke cafeteria. Right? And the reason is there is a culture in higher ed that can sometimes lean so far left that students believe that the badge of intellectual sophistication and the route to the readiest approval is just to mouth phrases like heteronormative, white supremacy, etc. And again, this is like the Bruni Griner thing. It is really important to talk about the structural racism that exists. It is really important to talk about instances and examples of white supremacy. But if you always cry wolf and you see it everywhere, you end up sounding to anybody who's looking at things in a dispassionate way, you end up sounding ridiculous. But you're also just traveling so far from this thing called truth that needs to matter.
You know, it sort of came to a head when the 3 university presidents testified in early December. And, you know, you had MIT, Harvard, and Penn. And all of a sudden, they were like lawyer-like in terms of the First Amendment. I mean, these are people with trigger warnings and all the other things. And so I think it's got people genuinely worried. How do you fix it?
Well, before I get to that, I do think that hearing bothers me for a lot of reasons, for the reasons it bothers a lot of people, but the commentary that followed it and much of the coverage of campus encampments and all of that, it really needs to be said that is a little bit of a caricature, right? Now, I'm at Duke, and Duke does not draw, because it's a Southern university, because it has a big sports tradition. If you are among the students who can get into a school with a 6% acceptance rate, which is what Duke is down to, and that tracks with a Harvard or a Yale, whatever, if you are the political activist type, you are more likely going to go to Brown or Yale than to Duke. So the student body at Duke, well, absolutely, like most people in that generation in college, leans left and all that, it's not the kind of heated political environment that some of the other campuses are. But even those campuses aren't as heated as the media portrays them. Most students care more about just getting A's, getting a job, graduating on time, etc., than they do about any political cause. But what draws media attention, and what kind of stands out and is the most provocative and interesting to talk about and wring our hands about is the exception to the rule. So we don't need to be quite as worried as we are because we're reacting to a minority of people on campus. But how do we change it? I mean, we have discussions about it, we throw a light on it. We have university leaders encourage faculty members to reward open discussion, to encourage that. And that actually is changing. There's a very pronounced trend in higher ed right now, where there are more and more funds going to organizations, kind of clusters of classes, groups of professors on campus that are essentially kind of the seats of heterodox, and you find them all over the place. There's like, they're often called the Center for Public Discourse, or they have names like that. And what they're really about is they're preserves of and evangelists for intellectual diversity on campus. So there is a movement in that direction. I think it's going to continue to move in that direction, partly because I think donors are demanding it, and that's a good thing.
So before I turn over to the audience, we've got an election coming up. We've had a whole hell of a lot.
Really?
Well, for me, I'm back in the Paleolithic.
Is anybody interested in that?
All that I say, you've been very involved, and written a lot in the last several weeks, first urging Biden to get out, then praising him for his decision. Today you wrote a piece about women and so forth. I want a couple of quick ones. Did the Democrats do this right in coalescing around Kamala, or should they have a more open process?
That's as much of a guess for me as for you or probably anyone here. I don't know. I think people who understand what an open process with this little amount of time would have looked like seem to have decided that that was going to be impossible or ruinous, and that the smartest thing was to coalesce around her. I defer to them. The only thing I know for sure is that Donald Trump must not be reelected. And if coalescing around Kamala, given the circumstances, given this moment in time, if that's the best route to that, then I cheer it.
How should she think about a vice president?
I'm not. I think she should think about sending. I think this is going to happen. I think if you look at the list, this is a fait accompli. But I think she should think about sending a message to the country that she wants to be. This should be true all the time for anyone, but I think it's especially important for her. I think she wants her choice to send a message to the country that she wants and intends to be a president for everybody. There's a big story at the top of the Times trending list right now about the serious examination Mark Kelly is getting. And he's getting such a serious look because he would say that to the country. Andy Bashir is getting a serious look because he would say that to the country. And again, everything I believe or think is about how do we make sure, now that, let's say she's the de facto nominee, she's the nominee, how do we make sure she defeats Trump? Her greatest weakness when the euphoria burns away, her greatest weakness is going to be the examination of her record and of statements she's made through time and elements of her record that are far to the left of whoever the average American or median American are. I don't know what the term is when you're talking about the political spectrum. She needs to say and do everything she can to resist being caricatured or pigeonholed as a lefty wacko, which, believe me, the Trump machine and the Republican Party are going to be expert at doing. And if she and the people around her are not thinking of that first and foremost when they choose a vice president, it's political malpractice of the highest order, but I guarantee you they're thinking about that.
Last question. Right before we came here, my wife sent me an article from Paul Pagala. I know Paul Pagala well because he took my federal courts class at Georgetown at the highest grade I ever gave. And what really pissed me off, he never came to class. Such a valuable, great teacher. True story. But Pagala was quoted as saying that Trump is thinking of taking down Vance and putting Nikki. Any chance?
It's funny, I heard this rumor right before we left to walk here tonight. I think there's got to be a chance for a couple of reasons. One of which is loyalty is not a word in Trump's vocabulary. And weirdly, Trump has this kind of vanity, and it's a vanity about how people are covered in the media and like whether they look weak or strong. And I think I mean, this is like such a sign of a crazy time we live in. I think stuff online, memes like J.D. Vance looking romantically at couches. Do people know about this? A friend of mine who has 2 daughters in their early 20s said that I should really hire one of them to give me a daily memo of what's happening online. And we all really need this, but this is just worth a second because it's such an example of what incredibly nonsensical times we live in. And I don't even mind that this made J.D. Vance look bad because I think he is a creep, right? But, you know, I mean, again, childless cat ladies. For a hot second, there was, I don't know what I'm reporting, but there was this kind of strand of commentary on the internet that claimed falsely that there was an anecdote in Hillbilly Elegy where he talked about a moment of sexual frustration and humping the couch, right? It's not in there's plenty of great stuff to be used against him in Hillbilly Elegy, but not fornication with a love seat, right? But before this could be disproven, or really because no one seemed to care whether it was true or not, you could have a really fun time, better than any comedy in the multiplexes right now. Go online and just search and put it on videos or images, J.D. Vance and couch, right? I was looking at a photo array just today of various couches looking like wounded and hurt. J.D. Vance had anyway, my point, to go back to Trump, I think this stuff is mortifying, emasculating, and raging to Donald Trump. He thought J.D. Vance made him look good. A celebrity of sorts, younger. Trump even said he's good looking. Trump and I have different tastes. But so I could believe it, and it might be a smart thing to do.
Going back to the...
But here's what I really love about the idea of it. Given J.D. Vance's extreme malleability, you know, and he's gone from Trump is America's Hitler to, you know, I mean, abject worship. I mean, if Trump dumps him, I have to assume, like, he'll be a socialist tomorrow. Like, en route, I mean, given his, like, en route to maybe being a nudist 2 weeks from that, and then a Mennonite next month. I would love to see, like, the kind of changes it unleashes in J.D. Vance. What do you think?
Kind of the theme in the title of the book. Who's got the grievance? Vance or the couch?
The couch.
All right, let's hear it from Frank. You got a question, share again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful. Frank, what is the future for centrists, for people who have traditionally sort of seen both sides of the table, or maybe are not as left-leaning in their politics as others? It sounds like you're describing a place where there really isn't a future for those of us who do not go so far to the left. Is that true?
No, I would say no. I think it's more complicated than that. I think it feels that way, and it should feel that way, especially because we have a primary system right now. Even more so in offices below the presidency, where you often get to the general election and your choices are two people who are at the extremes of each of their parties. because of low participation in primaries, because of gerrymandering, because of all these things that we can try to tackle. That would, we could. I believe that we're better off with nonpartisan primaries, open primaries. I believe we're better off with ranked choice voting. If you had enough of those things going on, I think you would end up with candidates who are more moderate in each party. I think it's important to remember there are a lot of reasons why Joe Biden was the Democratic nominee in 2020. But if you remember those early stages, he was standing there with Kamala and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and on and on. I mean, he was one of the most moderate, voices on stage. Maybe not as moderate as, say, Tim Ryan, whose politics are actually kind of complicated in that regard. But he ended up the winner at the end for a bunch of reasons that included his moderation and the sense among voters that that was the thing that would go the distance. And you've seen moderates triumph in many other circumstances. Under serious contention for the vice presidency, a politician I admire greatly, and I think others and all of us can learn from, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. His approval rating in that state is robust, which means he's doing just fine with the Democrats, and he's governing in a distinctly moderate way. And I interviewed him about that. I did a story a couple months ago about him, and I wasn't even looking forward to this moment because we didn't think Biden was dropping out, but I did a story on governors whose standing in their states was better than you would expect it to be, vis-a-vis what party they were versus what the people in the state were like. And what can be learned from that. And in that story, I have interviews with Josh Shapiro and Roy Moore and Andy Bashir. But the fact that they all exist and have thrived, I think that is cause for hope.
How do you want to do it? Do that to the gentleman.
Hey. Hi. That was brilliant and enjoyable. Thank you very much. So, from the Pleistocene age, when I was growing up, there were 3 TV channels. So you could have your nightly news from one or more of 3 white men in suits who appealed to you most. And the news was generally the same. And we have this proliferation of media today. People are using the word tribes. The media choices have allowed people to go where they feel best about the information that will be generated to them. So they're consuming their own opinions as opposed to refreshing them with opinions of others. Oops, sorry. Do you have any comment on that particular idea?
It's
Meaning you're segregated by...
Yeah, no, it's what I was referring to before, and I love the way you asked the question, because, I think we're in a worse place now, because it's so fractured, and there's no common set of facts, there's no shared narrative. You asked the question in a very smart and helpful way, which is, there's one of the bits of progress we've made, is you're right, it was 3 white men. Right? And it was a very small group of people who were usually from the same educational background, the same socioeconomic background, a small group of people, not just those men, but the people who were in the offices planning the newscast, were deciding for us what was important, and what we needed to. And that was not ideal at all. And now more people have voices. And if you want to be, you can be exposed to a much greater range of perspectives. But the downside, as you said, is that people aren't using the kind of tapestry we have now to look at the world in a broader way and to see more of the threads. They're just going to one little square millimeter of it and living there. I think one of the things we need to do as a society, we need to do it in schools, we need to do it around the kitchen table, we need to do it everywhere. Those of us who see this and understand this and are the adults in the room, we need, when we're talking to young people from the get-go, to make them more conscious of the importance and the impact of their information and media choices. I have found a discussion I find a way to have in every class I've taught at Duke. At some point, it's really easy to integrate, especially if you're teaching media-related journalism classes. I always have a moment where I ask all of the students to talk a little bit about what their main sources of news are, like what they look at every day, and then to reflect on what those things say, and then to ask themselves, like, how did that get set up? And it's almost never the case that they've constructed these information feeds, these little news microenvironments, in a mindful, deliberate, it like kind of happens to them. And if you ask them to pause and think about it, they often realize that it doesn't align with who they mean to be or with what they meant to happen. It was a kind of passive thing. You can get them to realize that. Once they realize that, they actually want to change it. And I think if you keep having the conversation, it may not move things enormously, but it can move things if we have that conversation in a sustained enough fashion with enough people. But I just don't think we talk about it, and I don't think we're very committed to spreading consciousness of that. In schools, outside of schools, everywhere.
So on that, I'm sorry, maybe someone else would.
Yeah, we got one in the front, we'll come back to it. I will point out, I asked about 30 questions, and I was told most of them were wrong. You asked one, and got a compliment.
I already said I pay for dinner.
I just want to know where you're sleeping tonight.
Joel, have pity on Regan.
I didn't say where she got it.
I'm a big fan, and I hope your finger is okay.
It's getting good.
I had believed that in 2016, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, and it could be I'm getting a little fuzzy too at 81, that you believed too that the media and the New York Times were to some degree responsible for Hillary's defeat. With that in mind, if the choice is democracy or not, what is the value of a David Brooks column, a report card on Kamala, on which she gets C+, C, C's? What do you do about that? Or is there anything that can be done about that? Or are you forced to present both sides, even though you know one side is the end of everything as we know it?
It's a great question, although I hesitate to say that because this gentleman's going to get mad at me. It's the latest in a non-interrupted string of great questions that I've received tonight. I don't think I ever wrote, and nor do I think the media or the Times is responsible for Hillary's defeat. So we may differ. I don't think, but I don't think I mean, I don't think I've written much about that, and my feelings about that are complicated, and I could make as good a case that James Comey is responsible for Hillary Clinton's defeat. I could make a case that Hillary Clinton or that Robbie Mook is responsible for Hillary Clinton's defeat. Ultimately, Americans are responsible for Hillary Clinton's defeat. The David Brooks column, so I see this differently, and that column is just one example. I think our job as the media, or at least if you're at a news organization that is not saying we're flying this one partisan color or whatever, I think it is our job to be honest about the world, right? And I think if you believe in democracy, you want to give people a full, honest picture and then trust them to process it the right way. I don't see a David Brooks column giving Kamala bad marks in areas where there's been plenty of journalism and evidence that those marks are deserved. I don't see that actually as running. First of all, I don't think it's his job to get Trump defeated. I think it's his job to eloquently communicate the world that he sees and what he thinks it's important that we see in it. But I also think, I feel very strongly about this. When David Brooks, he's just the example here, when he writes a dozen columns between now and election day, making clear how dangerous he thinks Trump is, making clear how much better a choice he thinks Kamala Harris is in that context, he may have some credibility because he did a report card that honestly said, C in this category, C minus here. I think if we become clear, if we become consistent and clear cheerleaders for one side, even if we're doing it for the most virtuous purposes, I think we lose credibility in a way that makes us less effective.
Thank you for this evening. To what degree do you think Trump has an innate genius for exploiting grievance? And what happens to the toothpaste when he's gone? Without that genius, does it continue to exist in the forceful way it does? Does it dissipate? Does the internet, as we've also said, have taken disparate grievance all around the country and made a movement of it?
Yeah, no, I think it will outlast Trump. It will absolutely outlast Trump. Because he wasn't just kind of stirring these currents, he was riding them. I mean, it's a chicken and egg thing to a large extent. But I think he is the master merchant of grievance, right? And I mean, the greatest bit of sorcery that he's performed is to be one of the kind of luckiest, most privileged, most advantaged, most coddled, most gilded people alive, and to convince all the people in the MAGA movement that he's a victim who is thus the perfect vessel for them, right? But I mean, what is grievance but, oh my gosh, I can never get a fair shake. Oh my gosh, look at how persecuted. I mean, he uses the word crucified. You know, Trump is Jesus. He's got his own branded Bible, right? But no, I mean, he realized, but I mean, you see other people realizing this all over the place, that nothing gave you currency at this moment in time, which is disturbing, like being able to portray yourself as a victim, right? That will outlast him because he was recognizing something that existed and exploiting it. In exploiting it, I think he has absolutely exacerbated it. And I think he has a unique talent for doing so because he actually believes he's a victim. And because I think the greatest political superpower is unsullied shamelessness. And few people have shamelessness as immaculate and immense as Donald Trump's.
I'm going to take that lady right
Hi. Oh, thanks. One of the things I like about your approach, Frank, is that you talk about grievance having a noble history, that it was an engine for change, needed change. I observe that there's a lack of curiosity and compassion about what's underneath the grievance, whether it's the guy with the flag on the back of his pickup truck or the woman who's driving to get an abortion across the country. Do you ever see this thing bending back toward decency where we want to find out what is charging that grievance?
I don't know, but I think it's not going to bend back that way unless we have leaders who model doing that, who model like saying, no, let's not simply curse and damn the person who is expressing their grievance in such a destructive and hateful way. Let's ask the question of what lies beneath it. I mean, one of the kind of sad things about the whole J.D. Vance trajectory is, I think people over-read into an overpraised hillbilly elegy in the way we're constantly, just like right now, the Kamala Harris exuberance will burn off, and 2 weeks from now, you'll see the media turn like a school of fish and whatever. I mean, we always sort of tend to get carried away. But one of the sad things about his whole trajectory, if you go back and look at that book was basically saying, before we just kind of ridicule or give up on or roll our eyes at certain people, let's understand how they got this way. At its best, that book did that, right? I think there are leaders who try to do that, who don't kind of engage in catcalls and all of that. I think we need more of them to do it, because one of the things that I think Trump and so many other politicians who've taken lessons from him and taken cues from him, one of the things they've done is they've begun behaving in ways that become huge green lights, become total permission. When you see Marjorie Taylor Greene, to use a way too obvious example, behaving the way she did. When you look at some of the more strident things people in the squad have said and done over time, it gives people permission to do the opposite of what you're saying, not to kind of try to understand people of different perspectives, but just to kind of demonize them. And so I think we need a better class of political leadership. We need more leaders who are modeling the kind of thing that you're looking for and hoping for.
over here, this gentleman.
Can you tell us anything that's not common knowledge about presidential candidate Kennedy?
RFK Jr.?
Yes.
No. No, I mean, I have not covered him. I don't have any history with him. I don't know his biography any better than someone else has read about him. I mean, I keep up on him. Just today, there was some weird comment where he kind of braced the world for the fact that there may be more women coming forward with sexual abuse or sexual harassment complaints against him because he said, I'm 70 and I've led a rambunctious life. That didn't completely align with my understanding of the dictionary definition of rambunctious. So I can tell you that, but that's not much.
April?
Hello.
So, one thing that really struck me that I thought was a beautiful way to begin this talk, which I love, is that you had talked about how you imagined that COVID would bring us together a little bit in the way that 9/11 had. I had the same fantasy when it first began, besides being absolutely terrified and trying to think of ways to like feed myself and my husband. So I'm wondering, and then you said that things really started spiraling away from that kind of gathering of togetherness that happened after 9/11 around 2004. Do you have any kind of sense of what the symptoms of those were? Because within the last several years of COVID, it seemed to me that literally every person I know was sleeping worse, highly anxious, just fraught with terror about Trump getting back in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't know anyone who wasn't feeling wounded by the way that everything happened. But was there something in 2004? I'm wondering about, like, if people have a general sense of the climate not being able to be supportable for us anymore, of there being too many people in the world to feed. There's all sorts of things that I can't imagine, but was there anything that...
Well, 2004 is just, I'm using it as the marker of when from that moment forward you never saw 50% or more people saying they were satisfied.
Right.
But I think if you, so this, I'm speaking in general terms, but when you mentioned some things, I think the reality of income inequality around that time and subsequently became much clearer to people. I think not so much in 2004, but if you kind of move forward to 2008, you know, if you look at the kind of near collapse of the world economy, if you look at the bursting of the housing bubble, if you look at what became a kind of dominant theme of conversation was that the banks had been bailed out, but what about Main Street? What about all these people who lost their homes, who couldn't get more, et cetera? I think in the mid-2000s, 2004 up to 2010, including the birth of the Tea Party and all that, I think the awareness of economic inequality, of income inequality, of a sort of really warped playing field in that regard. I think people lived that, felt it, and also were exposed to discussions about it, and were thus angered by it in a way as never before. It became more and more clear, and it became a bigger and bigger part of the discussion, that we do not have the social mobility in this country that is such a big part of the American mythology, right? And my colleague David Leonhardt wrote a whole book about this called Ours, that came out about 9 months ago, called Ours Was the Shining Future. And it was basically a requiem for the American dream, or a requiem for social mobility. So I think that happened. I also think in ways that have positive aspects and are kind of good at their core, we began having discussions about marginalized groups that needed to be had, but that I think in many instances spiraled out of control and became almost a fetishization of victimhood. So I think all of those things have been happening since 2004, and you can see a lot of them clustering around the 2008-2009 period.
Thank you, gentlemen in the back.
Hello. First, let me say
Okay, thanks.
I truly enjoy reading your opinion pieces. They're educational, and I find it very, very helpful. I have two questions, one serious, one not so serious. not so serious question is, how's your finger? And did you replace the kitchen
I'm in the
door?
process, luckily it's not my middle finger, or you take this the wrong way. I'm in the process of losing the nail, but I can type again, so it's great. I write too much about myself in my newsletter, so he knows that I broke my finger 2 weeks ago.
Second, the serious question. With the, I guess, demise of affirmative action with the Supreme Court, there's a lot of harassment going towards Kamala Harris for her being in DEI. And I'd just like to get your take on your feelings on the DEI issue and how the right is kind of leaning towards changing the DEI to an MEI, more on a merit basis. I'd like to get your feeling on that.
I mean, that's so complicated because, like, so you just use the word merit, which we love to use, right? And I say this as someone who I don't like the idea of quotas. I think the problem with what happened with DEI is a shorthand for a lot of different things. But I think we became over-focused on some things that ended up, again, undermining those causes. But you use the word merit. Who determines merit? You know, I mean, that is such a... We need to talk about, and we need to try to make decisions based on whatever our best estimation of merit is, but we need to constantly, and I think this is why things like DEI came about, we need to constantly acknowledge that merit is an intrinsically and inevitably subjective judgment, and it's an inevitably flawed judgment, and I think for too many years, we acted as if it was as simple as an SAT score, and it's just not. And being more honest about that, I think would have avoided getting into this kind of place. You know, I think you're seeing a lot of dismantle. There's a lot of different ways to go. Kamala Harris is a DEI candidate. Every human being in this world who has risen high and far has been the beneficiary of the moment in time in which they were striving and of various circumstances, right? And is she where she is because there are aspects of who she is that worked very well with the moment? Absolutely. I'm hard-pressed to find any successful person about whom that's not also true. And so, well, I think we do need to have discussions about whether we've been making adjustments and kind of doling out forgivenesses when it comes to like judging applications, you know, based on external factors. I think the kind of I think so many aspects of this discussion are reductive and ahistorical, and I think we need to be honest, again, to go back to the beginning, about how subjective the concept of merit is to begin with.
April, since you paid for the microphone, you have the last question.
I actually wanted to know, since you love San Carlo almost as much as Nicole and Joel now, are you going to change your vote to be able to vote here for John Kaplan, the moderator?
April. That's a congressional district. I'm in a purple state. I vote in North Carolina, where we have a governor's race between a perfectly sensible, honorable, centrist Democrat and a lunatic. I ain't changing my voter registration. And lest you think I'm a rash or intemperate person, just do some reading about Mark Robinson, and you will actually say, my God, Frank Bruni's way too subtle.
I mean, your state's amazing. It brought us Frank Graham and it brought us Jesse Holmes. I mean, it's like a lunatic asylum.
And North Carolina may bring you the next vice president if she picks Roy Cooper. We'll see.
I got it. All right, folks. Thank you very much.